Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the last in this series of webinars. And it's an absolute pleasure to have John Roberts here, who's an upland archaeologist and specialist in the field. And so it's a great pleasure to have John here to present what is a fascinating and very vast topic to you all. So, mae'n braf croesawu John Roberts yma heno. Da ni'n edrych ymlaen I sgwrs diolch yn fawr. Okay, so John works in the day for Snowdonia National Park as the archaeologist. So that's his formal job, but this is outside. This is doing this outside of his work for me. So if you have any questions, please do just use the chat function. There should be hopefully some time at the end for question and answer. So yeah, anything that pops up, just please, we can deal with those right at the end. But for now, I'll hand over to John and enjoy.
Jim, pawb, hi, diolch yn fawr am y croeso I siarad yma. To the introduction in the Cymraeg, I'm not going to give the presentation in Welsh, I'm going to give the presentation in Saesneg, in English. Has everybody come into the room? Or if you...
Yeah, if there's anyone popping in, I'll
you'll just let them in now, will you?
But no, I think we can go ahead if you're...
We ready to start?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I can share screen now, Jim, yes?
I'll tell you when it's shared.
One second.
To admit as okay.
Okay.
Perfect. That's great. That's sharing. I'll mute myself now, John.
Yeah. Great. Thanks. And how's the signal? Because we had problems before. Jim, just let me know before we start.
There's a little bit of interference in the background, but your voice is clear and the screen's really clear.
Okay, so if anything happens with the signal, just give me a shout during the talk, will you?
Will do.
But otherwise, welcome everybody. Thanks very much for coming along. It's a massive topic that we've got tonight because we're covering really many thousands of years of human history and intervention in the landscape. But we are, for obvious reasons, going to focus on the uplands, not just the mountains, but the kind of mountain fringes. So it's archaeology in the uplands. And there's someone waiting to come in, Jim, but you'll sort those out, yes?
Yeah, I'll do everything in the background, John. That's fine. No problem.
So I wanted to start with this area of Talafan. It's near Rowen, above the Conwy Valley. Just to give you an idea, as Jim said, I work as the archaeologist for the Snowdonia National Park Authority. So a lot of the examples I'm going to use are necessarily going to be from Snowdonia because it's the area I know very well. But I'm going to bring in some examples from other upland areas of the UK as well. This is a fantastic multi-period landscape. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with it, but you can immediately see that there's lots of kind of multi-phased features here. There's a roadway. There's actually the line of a Roman road that you can see. You can follow my cursor. There are a series of these round enclosures, which are actually settlement compounds, and then fields that are associated with them, which underlie that road. And then, of course, these later field walls. So it's a multi-period landscape of very great complexity. And you can see that when you look at the Ordnance Survey map for this area. I'm going to just turn my video off, by the way, because I'm looking at a larger screen, and also because we had problems when we did a tryout the other day with the signal, and so I'm going to cut that until later on in the talk. So if we look at the Ordnance Survey map for that area, we can see that there's a huge amount of interest. So this is where the photograph was set. And here I've highlighted all of the features on the 1 to 25,000 OS map that are marked as an antiquity. It's this Gothic script here, and it includes the Roman road that I mentioned. It includes standing stones, cairns. What are cairns? We're going to come back to that during the course of the talk. Burnt mound. It includes homestead, hut circles, enclosures, house platforms, fort, hut circle, and so on, cairns and so on. So a very busy landscape. But it isn't just the Gothic script which denotes, kind of an old feature, an antiquity. It's also other features in marked on the map, which include sheepfolds, the quarries, the tips, and so on here, a multicellular sheepfold with the northern Snowdonia Carnevai type. So all of these tell us a great deal about the nature of the way that people have inhabited landscapes over really great long periods of time in a particularly busy area. But I think this is quite characteristic of many of our upland areas. And what do we see on the Ordnance Survey maps? Well, I've kind of picked out a few examples of the types of feature name that you see, and the profusion here, the scatter here, is perhaps suggestive of the rather confused nature of these, because some of them are really descriptive, some of them relate to a period like medieval township, some of them really take a lot of prior knowledge for granted, like tumulus, for example. Some of them are, well, you've got two different types of fonts. You've got an antiquated font here, which is the Gothic type, and then you've got all of the Roman features, which are marked with this kind of classical font. But it's difficult to pick them out, and it's difficult to weave them into a narrative, I think. And what I hope to do this evening, and we're going to go up to, by the way, around about the end of the early Bronze Age, so about kind of 3,000 years ago or so, but I'm going to start very, very early on. And the reason for doing that is that lots of the features that are on the maps kind of concentrate on the prehistoric period, so I'm going to kind of really focus on that in tonight's talk. But what I want to do is to try and give you a bit of a kind of background kind of context for these, tell you how to weave them into a story of the changing relationship between people and landscape and environment over time, give you a real sense of kind of time depth in the landscape. And also, hopefully, this is the kind of information that will allow you to, firstly, get more out of your visits to the uplands, because the majority of you, if not all of you, I take it, are people who are out and about in the mountain landscape to a considerable extent, either kind of professionally or for pleasure, or a combination of the two. And also perhaps it will help you to prepare ahead of your visits, particularly if you're working with groups, in terms of building up a kind of repertoire of knowledge, and also kind of stories about the landscape and the way that you can read the Ordnance Survey map to tell you that story. A few basic principles before we go into the kind of the run through, as it were. First of all, I'd say that lots of these don't look very glamorous on the ground, particularly in the uplands. But the reason that there's so much on the maps is that they're generally features which are built of stone, like this. It's a relic field wall from about 2,000, 2,500 years ago. But we have to remember that in the past, these weren't just, these kind of simple features. They represented communities, they represented an economy, they represented a way of kind of living in and working the land. And just to see them as a kind of a simple pile of stones makes them kind of very mundane. So I'm hoping to draw out some of the richness that we've learned over the years from excavations and from other, kind of other bits of research and from our interpretation, and also examples from small-scale societies across the world today, just to kind of bring some of this stuff to life, so that when you go out, you don't just look at the map and think, oh, okay, it's another pile of stones, because there's a danger that quite a few of these things will look a bit like that. And in the same spirit, really, a kind of glossy and glamorous find. This is the lumula from Llachyd Iorichaf, which is Brunk here. It's just to the northwest of Criccieth. The find itself is in the National Museum. To breathe some life into this kind of glamorous find, and to make it something more meaningful in terms of the people that made it, we need to interpret it, and we need to use our imagination. And this is an imaginative reconstruction that considers it as a piece of kind of ornamentation, a piece of jewelry. It's something that was produced by or for the National Museum. But I'd argue that, yeah, that's fine, that's fair enough. And it kind of looks a little bit like us in a way, projected back to the past, and it speaks to our kind of preconceptions or assumptions about the past as well. But have a look at this image, which is from a singing and dancing and kind of almost ritualized warfare ceremony in Papua New Guinea. And you'll see that similar lunular type forms are included within the regalia, within the ritual costume. Now, why can't we imagine these or reconstruct these things in a more kind of, thrilling, imaginative and creative way? So we have to think about the very, very different, it's a huge time gap in some cases between us and these places in the landscape or these features. And it's really important to think about the great diversity of ideas and behaviors and, kind of appearances that might represent. Now, the kind of final point I wanted to make in terms of general principles along similar lines is, was prompted by a visit to one of these land, not to this area, but to the landscape above Pemanawd in Northwest Wales recently, with someone who I was doing some work on monuments with. And during the course of the conversation, a question came up, which was, so when these people made this, and it was about 4,000 years ago, actually, it was stone circles, when people kind of made these things, were they as capable as us? Were their abilities, their intellectual abilities, kind of the same as our ones? And I must say that as an archaeologist, I've just taken it for granted that everybody realised that for tens of thousands of years, we have effectively been the same organism. We've been the same types of people. We've had the same capacities. And the reason that I think that's really important that point is really important to make is that just because you're looking at piles of stone in the landscape, just because you're looking at the remains of hundreds or thousands of years ago, and they're quite basic, doesn't mean that people's culture was necessarily rudimentary, or that their capacity was also really rudimentary or basic. And I'd really like you to convey a sense of that when, if you can, when you're out and about in the mountains or when you're talking to groups, because I think it's very important. In many ways, whilst their kind of technologies were much more kind of rudimentary and more simple than ours, or at least the materials that they had at their disposal were more simple, their social and kind of symbolic and sacred worlds were far, far richer. And all we have to do is look at the cave paintings from Lascaux in the Dordogne in France, put here from about 17,000 years ago, to remind us of just how sophisticated not only people's kind of artistic and creative abilities were, but also their kind of sacred and metaphorical and symbolic worlds. In many ways, we are, in fact, I think we could argue, impoverished people today in terms of our kind of intellectual and creative worlds in comparison to thousands of years ago in the past, rather than vice versa. So those are my kind of initial principles, really. And what I wanted to do next was to cover from the end of Jim's talk a few weeks ago, which covered glaciation. So looking at the kind of end of the last ice age, through to our kind of more modern world. It's 12,000 years of human history. In fact, as I said, I'm going to concentrate really on the earlier stuff, going through to the early Bronze Age. It's a bit of a big undertaking, so I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I hope I do it justice, and secondly, put your seatbelts on, and we'll kind of go ahead and see how we get on, because I've prepared a structure for it, which I hope is legible. I tried out with Jim the other day, and I think it works. So hopefully you can read all of this on your screens. We've got a timeline. It's a kind of reverse logarithm in a way. And I want to speak as much as possible in terms of years ago from now. It isn't very scientific, but I hope it gives a better sense of time depth in terms of human intervention in the landscape. I've included the traditional archaeological periods, like the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Roman, and so on in there. And we're just going to kind of build this up For people who aren't so happy with thousands of years ago and want something more traditional to fall back on, I've included a handy table which gives you if kind of BC type dates, should be before Christian era actually, and also AD Anno Domini dates, and compares those to before present. So that's going to stay for kind of, well, the bulk of the talk really. It's going to stay in the right hand corner there. But I've also put in a kind of climate change timeline, and it's kind of very rough and ready. But I think it helps to give a bit of a context, particularly for the early part of the talk, and allows me to make a point as well about the later periods. And I've taken that information from this article, which uses paleo-environmental evidence. So it uses pollen grains, study of pollen grains, and also the study of insect remains, usually recovered from acidic soils like peats, both of those, the pollen and the insect remains. And it's the green line focuses on summer high temperatures. And the point I wanted to make is kind of twofold. How dramatic the change was from the end of the period that Jim spoke about recently with the end of glaciation. We'll come back to that. But also how during the later periods, really from the kind of late Neolithic, Bronze Age onwards, so from about 4,000 years ago onwards, we're quite used to giving interpretations which say, well, actually, because the landscape changed and because the climate changed, people must have done this and they must have done that. But in a way, they're quite simple or oversimplified explanations, and they're rather deterministic. In fact, these kinds of small-scale societies with their subsistence economies were able to accommodate changes, to a greater or larger extent. Yes, you can see a changing kind of tide line, as it were, of altitude use within the uplands varying over time. But nevertheless, it isn't like the kind of globalized large-scale societies that we have today and the impact that climate and the climate change has on that. Having said that, I certainly don't want to sound like a climate change denier in any way whatsoever. And so I've included this this timeline of temperature change over the last couple of thousands of years to show just how dramatic you all know this, but just how dramatic and how different modern warming is. So I just want to decouple what I'm saying in terms of people not being kind of victims to or not being kind of spoken to or determined by some of the kind of smaller scale climate changes over the last 4,000 years in comparison to what's happening today, because it's on a completely different scale. So there's no denigration at that point. So what I'm going to do now in terms of building up this timeline is to add in another category, so headlines. So I'm going to build up types of sites, themes, and so on. As you'll see, this will make sense when the text comes up. The orange bits aren't visible in the upland landscape, but hopefully most of the other ones are. And I'm then going to give you on this table examples of Ordnance Survey map items. And as I said before, we've got the antiquated script, which is generally non-Roman, so prehistoric and medieval. We've got the Roman ones. And I don't want this to turn into a kind of GCSE geography lesson, but you know from your keys, don't you, there's lots of information about antiquities, sites of battles. It's just useful to discuss earthworks, actually. So you can see up here that these are what we call hashes, markings, which just give you an idea of topography of cut or built up mounded features. The upper bit of the triangle of these hashes is at the top of a break of slope, and the kind of the point points downwards. So you can see here that we've got a ditch, and then the other kinds of features, of course, are churches, and also I just included here because it's useful historic landscape information, boundary posts and boundary stones, and mileposts and milestones. But I think some of this is for a follow-up talk for the later periods. Okay, so this is the kind of structure I'm going to build up, and I'm going to take away the before present crutch and just move that over to give us a little bit more space, and then go back to the Ice Age, where Jim left off. It's probably worth reminding ourselves that the end of the last Ice Age was very complicated. There were fluctuations in the extent of ice and in vegetation cover, and also in terms of climate and in terms of human presence. This is the late glacial maximum of the British Irish ice sheet about 24,000 years ago, when we don't, as far as we know, no people were present in the British Isles. The map's it's a nice illustration, but it's a little bit misleading. And of course, Britain was part of the continental landmass at this point, because sea levels were lower, because so much of the globe's water was bound up in the ice. This rather complicated table is here just to make the point that people, whatever kinds of people those were, and there are different species of people, as we know, have been in Britain from at least 500,000 years ago, probably earlier, but this is the time of the first human remains from Boxgrove in southern England. And the species of person, of hominid, that was present at that time was called Homo heidelbergensis. You don't need to remember these, don't worry. It's just to make a series of points, which is that as the climate's changed, vegetation's changed, sometimes we have human presence in the landscape, and sometimes we have absence. So here's a long period of absence, and here again, at this period of the late glacial maximum, I just showed you with the very thick ice cover or extensive ice cover over Britain and Ireland, there weren't people present in the landscape. Neanderthals were the species which was in Britain, although obviously it came and went depending on the nature of the environment and landscape at that time. And then our own species, so modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, which is related to but not immediately descended from Neanderthals, was in Britain from somewhere around 40,000 years ago to, in case of the first example in Wales, 33,000 years ago. And I said that the end of the last ice age was complicated. Here we can see that there's a really cold snap from about over 2,000 years, from 13 to 11,000 years ago, and that saw new glaciation in the kind of the high uplands in Britain, including in Snowdonia. So just included a kind of map of some of the ice sheets during that period. And this is the kind of landscape that we're looking at that time. It's a parallel from Greenland today. And the reason that I've gone back this far, obviously there's nothing on our OS maps, on our Ordnance Survey maps. So far back, the evidence is very kind of very ephemeral, very slight. It's in the form of stone tools and mostly things like bone and so on found in cave sites where it's protected from the harsh environment of the time. But what we do have close to home for me at least, and for some of you, is this find of a very kind of brilliantly actually decorated horse chin or horse mandible. It's in the British Museum. It's from Kendrick's Cave on the Great Orme, and it dates to about 12,500 years ago during this very cold period. And it's just good to remind ourselves of when people were first in our kind of landscape. Okay, this isn't an upland landscape, it's on the upland fringes. And they weren't present, these people, in Britain all year round. It's very unlikely anyway. It's still cold. There's still a very kind of frozen turf, frozen ground kind of landscape. This is a lovely reconstruction, I think, of Llandudno and the Great Orme at that time, just making the point about the fact that the sea was still a distance out, and that there was a vast plain in this area, which would have been a fantastic kind of location for hunting the herds of large animals that kind of roamed these areas and could move quite freely as well, backwards and forwards between the British mainland and the continent. We know from the analysis of the bones in these caves, of human bones, that people's diet had about 30% marine content, mostly seals, I think, and that also they were hunting these large animals. So, for example, bison and reindeer, and the horse, of course. This is a type of ancestor to modern horses, which survived in Siberia through into the 19th century. We're moving forward in time now, because during the Mesolithic, just after the end of the last ice age, Started off with a kind of open tundra-like landscape. You can see on the right-hand side here of kind of open grasslands, but also of scrub, birch scrub, and so on. Still very cold conditions, but warming up quite dramatically as we come through the Mesolithic. But about 8,000 years ago, Britain became an island, and people's way of life had changed quite considerably from the previous period that we saw at Kendrick's Cave, because they were present in Britain all year round, and they were people who relied on gathering, fishing, and hunting. So they had a mixed economy, and they were mobile around the landscape, following the different resources and the different seasons. I've said mobile and that there's simplification here, because it's likely that for some of them, for example, where resources were very rich all year round, especially where there's kind of marine or sea resources, they would have had kind of permanent camps. And the kinds of features that we have aren't especially visible in the landscape, but it tends to be worked stone tools, particularly very small stone tools, which are the kinds of things that could be easily carried around the landscape because they're quite mobile, and they'd be made into these composite artifacts here, an arrowhead. But then during the Mesolithic, so from about 8,000 through to 6,000 years ago, the landscape became increasingly wooded because the kind of climate had warmed up to a large extent, and it favoured a different kind of environment. And the resources that people had at their disposal changed as well. This is the skeleton of an aurochs, by the way, a kind of ancestor to cattle. It's a large animal with a huge horn span, but it lived to begin with in the more open landscape, but it adapted to living in the increasingly wooded landscape. But then wild boar and roe deer were also added to the kind of repertoire of the resources of these people. And I've just included a few here, like salmon, for example. Salmon's a good point in terms of the upland landscape, because we know from finds of these kinds of stone tools way up at the sources of rivers, in Snowdonia, but particularly in the Scottish Highlands, that there are areas where there are very, very large quantities of either these tools or the materials, the kind of the waste stone effectively that's left behind in camp areas where these tools have been either made or maintained. And they've built up in large numbers because people return to them during the correct season for kind of year after year, decade after decade, maybe hundreds of years after hundreds of years. And this is the first time that we see a feature marked on the Ordnance Survey map, I think, the first one I could think of anyway. I'm cheating a little bit because it isn't an upland setting, but it's a kind of relatively remote setting. It's the Hebrides, it's the Ronsay, and these are in the form of these middens or shell mounds, and they're huge mounds. These are other examples from the Scottish mainland. They become huge middens that collect over tens or hundreds of years. As I've said, people are living in the same places in the landscape or returning to the same places in the landscape time and time again. And these have mussel shells, oyster shells, whelks and cockles and so on. But also, interestingly, interlayered within these or found amongst them have been animal bones, but also human bones. So is this some kind of ghoulish practice of kind of cannibalism or something? No, I want to kind of move away from this rather kind of sensationalized idea about the past and go back to what I said earlier about thinking creatively and imaginatively about the very different sacred and symbolic lives that people had in the past. And it's important to see these as remains of the ancestors of these Mesolithic people built into what's effectively a very kind of monumentalized feature within the landscape, still visible to us today. After all, these date to about 7,000 to 5,000 years ago. So after 7,000 years, there's still a kind of monumental presence in the landscape. And maybe it's no mistake that during our next period, the Neolithic, which starts from about 6,000 years ago, we also see mounds and also tokens of ancestors within the landscape. But we're going to start to see much more of a presence on our Ordnance Survey maps now, and also within the upland landscape. This is the time of the use of the first domesticated livestock and crops. in the British Isles. So grain, sheep and goats, cattle, but it's also a time of new technologies. We find remains of these kinds of pottery vessels on sites of the period, and also here a kind of classic feature of the Neolithic polished stone axes. Here's a hafted example. This one actually is a European one found in Britain, but there are sites and locations from across Britain where suitable stone was quarried. One of those, by the way, is above Penrhyn Mawr in the Carneddau. Another very famous example is in the Langdale Valley in the Lake District. And although they don't have a physical presence in the landscape, we see some of the kind of earliest houses that we know about from the British Isles. This is a series of post holes found during a very large-scale open area excavation of the proposed business park just outside Bangor. It's Park Keggin. And this is a kind of reconstruction of those kinds of houses, very large timber halls, effectively. And here, a kind of reconstruction of what some of these might have looked like within the landscape of southern Britain. And I just want to kind of point out that, of course, these new technologies and these new ways of making a living from the land had a considerable impact. But nevertheless, it's probably quite a kind of shifting or kind of regional form of movement that people have. These buildings may not have been the kind of main way that people lived in the landscape. They could have had a very kind of ceremonial or communal function to them and be more to do with gatherings. It looks like, on the basis of our evidence from pollen grains, for example, that the landscape is still very wooded. It's mostly deciduous woodland, and that there is kind of a shifting series and sequence of clearings across the landscape. So what's happening in the uplands, and what evidence do we have on our maps and in our upland landscapes? Well, I'm going to focus now on communal tombs, communal ancestral tombs. Here we've got some examples from the area to the southeast of Harlech. It's Corsegedel. It's a portal dolmen, so this kind of massive capstone supported on a stone, and originally it would have had a cairn or pile of rocks around it. It's marked on the BOS map as burial chamber, by the way. And other examples from quite close by, but in a much more decidedly upland setting here. In other areas, it would be called chamber cairns, but it's used the kind of traditional name for them, Carneddau Hengum, so the cairns of the old valley, as it were. And here, this is a capstone. Here's a capstone. There are these kinds of portal dolmens buried within these massive stone piles, these massive stone cairns. I should have kind of thought about this before I started the talk, actually, but I'm off the top of my head from last time I visited, I'd say that they're about 35 to 40 meters long here. You get a sense of the scale because the 19th century field wall cuts across one of them. Actually, it's reused, hasn't it, a lot of the stone from the cairns, and yet they're still massive. And here it's cut in half or divided. Two of these portal dolmens, two of these chambered tombs, they probably stood as freestanding tombs in the landscape, and then they were connected up by this cairn of rock. But what are these, and what's their significance, and what do they tell us about people and their kind of practices at the time, 6,000 years ago or so? Well, an example from the Comrie Valley gives us another clue. This is at Capel Garmon. You can see here how there's a passageway and then side chambers leading off it. A similar period of monument, but in a different area. This is from South Wales, gives us a clue, because in this area bones survived, and we can see how it wasn't just that whole individuals were buried in different parts of the tomb. In other words, the kind of different cells were set aside like catacombs in a way for different people when they died. It seems that on death, the skeleton was kind of broken up and in some way, and that different bits of the skeleton could be placed in different areas, or even bits of people of different ages could be placed in different parts of the tomb. And this is really significant because it's a very different kind of form or attitude towards death than the one that we have today, isn't it? Where the individual is on death, still has the kind of the sanctity and the identity of that person. What we think about this period is that on death, the kind of the sense or spirit of the person goes to join the mass, the host of the ancestors, rather than surviving with their individual identity. And I suppose that's appropriate for a time where, over very, very long periods, hundreds and thousands of years, society changes in very, very, very slow ways. They're small-scale societies, and they're not just their technologies, but potentially some of their ideas remain quite static over a long time. So the sense of having a very long ancestral period before you is kind of really appropriate to the scale of those societies. I said earlier on that I would try and kind of bring a more imaginative perspective to some of this, and here are some examples from Madagascar in kind of today's world. So kind of small-scale societies where there are collective tombs, so more than one person buried together, but also where there are, in some cases, very elaborate funeral rituals, which might involve taking a person or taking a bit of a person out of the tomb for a celebration. It might involve taking kind of offerings of food and drink, libations to the tomb. And we know from bones found on Neolithic settlement sites and in other contexts that bits of people seem to have circulated around the community. They didn't just go to the tomb on death and remain there. It's almost as if the kind of the dead and the ancestors play an important part in the world of the living. We're going to move forward in time, and I just want to point out that this kind of sense of the ceremony and the sacred doesn't just relate to the tombs that we see in the uplands. There's a whole load of monuments that I'm not going to go into much detail about, or any detail about really, because they're kind of more lowland in their setting, but they include henge monuments like this one at Arbelo in the Peak District, a bank, a ditch, and this one has a stone circle within it. It's kind of the same age as Stonehenge, for example. But there's also other kinds of monuments which look like they're about people gathering in very large numbers. And we have to bear in mind that for these small-scale societies and the relatively low population densities that they had, gathering at particular times of year in particular places is probably really crucial to the way that they kind of just survive, not just exchange ideas, but they exchange goods and gifts, and their kind of ceremonial practice reproduces their societies, as it were. Those forms of monuments take the form of what we call cursus monuments, which are like a long ceremonial processional causeway. There's one of those actually at the site that I mentioned earlier on, just outside Bangor at Park Higgin. And also earlier than that, these large causewayed enclosures, which seem to be ditched enclosures, almost kind of places for ceremonies, but also as kind of laying out places for the dead. But I wanted to introduce ceremonial monuments here because as we move through to our next period, by the way, burial chambers and chamber cairn are the kinds of things that you'll see in the maps from this Neolithic period. But as we move through into the Bronze Age, the early Bronze Age, about 4,500 years ago, ceremonial monuments and also a kind of architecture of death and the dead remains to be very, very important. In terms of the landscape and the environment during the Neolithic, particularly towards the end of the Neolithic, you see an increase in the pollen record of loss of woodland, so deforestation, and also potentially a rise in upland pastures. So clearly that's very important to us with our upland setting. So the Bronze Age, early Bronze Age, 4,500 years ago onwards. And these are the kinds of features that you see on your maps. We're looking at tumulus, cairn, keys, stone circle, circle cairn, standing stone, cut and ring marked rock. A tumulus, by the way, is a kind of catch-all term for what would otherwise be known as a kind of earthen barrow. Sometimes it's used in place of cairn. It's basically a a large burial mound from this early Bronze Age period. And attitudes towards death and ritual in the landscape seem to change but remain very important. And that's that, as opposed to the Neolithic, when we had those chambered cairns and the portal dolmens and so on, some of them in the uplands but in relatively small numbers, large monuments but in small numbers. In the early Bronze Age, we see literally thousands of monuments and massive proliferation, and really quite a different attitude towards death and ritual. It includes burial of whole individuals, but it also includes collective burial, a tradition which obviously stretches back to the Neolithic, but in a different form, because cremation becomes really important to this time, and quite often within these burial mounds or burial cairns where they've been excavated, pottery vessels. These ones are from quite early on in the period. This is known as a beaker, and it's very characteristic of a type of pot that develops on the European mainland about 4,500 years ago, and very quickly finds its way into the British Isles and becomes very widespread. But also other types of vessel which can have cremations within them, within these mounds, as if there's an expression still of the collective identity of these groups. Close to home again, this is Droskel in the Carneddau, an example of things that are very, very common across the high uplands of Britain, these mountaintop cairns. Now, where these have been excavated, the kind of lower lying examples tend to have more burials and have the features and the finds related to death and remembrance. Not all of the high mountain cairns, although not very many of them have been excavated, but where they have, not all of them do have burials within them. They seem to be playing with the idea of a burial mound, but in some cases, perhaps the ancestral idea, the sense of a kind of ancestral spirit, which follows on from what I was saying about the Neolithic period before it, it can still be seen to be relevant. And I would kind of try and describe it or imagine it as being very similar to the obus, or the kind of the hilltop cairns, the pass cairns of Nepal or of Mongolia, where there's they're places where of veneration, they're places for spirits, they're places where people can undertake kind of rituals to remember or to pay homage to those spirits in the landscape. So that's really the context for these kinds of high upland, high mountain cairns. Other kinds of features we find are keists. It's a term which is actually used quite widely across Britain, but obviously comes from the Welsh, from the Cymraeg. It's simply a box of stone, and they can be found either on their own or with a cairn around them. This is an example of a cairn that's from near Beswicoed in Snowdonia. You can see the cairn here. And these keists would have taken whole burials, usually of this form, perhaps accompanied by the beaker pot, squashed into a crouched position within them, and most likely this stone was placed on top of the keist and it's been moved over time, it's been kind of displaced away from it. So sometimes we find them on their own, sometimes we find the broader cairn around them, almost as if this is the first act of burial, the kind of the placement of the individual and the skeleton within the stone box, and then later on the cairn can build up around it, sometimes with other burials in a kind of collective fashion included within the cairn. But we also see other kinds of ceremonial monument which really move away from the idea of ritual and a kind of reference to death, and that's in the form of standing stones, of stone circles, and of circular forms in a kind of more elaborate type of architecture. Here, a cairn with a really amazing and impressive kind of array of raked standing stones. They're all set at an angle within it. This is at Bryn Caravaner, not far in the kind of uplands, not far away from Harlech. The context for all of these, I'd say, and the fact that there's a really great number of them and they increase massively from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age, is to do with this point that I made earlier on about the rise of the upland pastures. We can see from the pollen record that in the uplands, tree coverage dramatically decreases as we go through the Bronze Age. We can also see that grassland pollen increases also dramatically, as do the kind of the weeds of grazed pastures. And it is probably no coincidence that these kinds of features, both referencing death and specific people, the individuals, but also the collective, mentioned here, the community, and also the ancestral spirits, mark out places in the uplands, which in the case of these cairns look out over very large areas, perhaps over the kind of the traditional lands associated with particular groups, or in the case of these types of monument, they're often in kind of, they're nestled in more localized places, like mountain passes, or in an area which has a kind of is a bowl or a natural upland pasture or plateau area. And I think the context here is that people are bringing their animals up to the mountains in the summer. Summer pasturing transhumance is a very ancient tradition in many of our upland areas, and continue to influence, actually, as we'll see another time, the archaeology of these periods, the early medieval, and the Roman periods in particular. But seasonal use has to be negotiated and renegotiated over time. So you have to make sure that when you come to take your stock back up to an area, that somebody else doesn't encroach upon your bit of land. Or it may well be, as we find in other parts of the world today, that these mobile groups who move around the landscape with their herds use a particular part of that landscape at a particular part of the growing season and then move on. And the movement of them around different parts of the uplands, from valley to valley, is quite carefully scheduled and arranged to make sure there's no tension, because of course access to resources is one of these areas that classically leads to tensions, skirmishing, raiding maybe, and to kind of small scale conflict. And through these monuments, I would argue, people are rewriting their permission to be in a certain place by referencing their gods and ancestors and the remains of their forebears in different parts of the landscape. This is also a time where moving away from, I included these, this is from Northumberland, it's rock art, so you can see that on the US maps sometimes you find cup and ring marked rock, very rare in Snowdonia, these kind of rock carvings, but really common in areas of northern England, in particularly the northeast. This example is from to the north of Wooler on Doddington Moor, and the moor has lots of these kind of special symbols. I can't give you a straightforward answer as to what they mean. They could have meant, and they do mean, a variety of things to different people. But I'd make a similar point, and I think it'd be worth making a similar point if you're in these areas working with your groups, which is that they're clearly a kind of a way of marking out an area of the landscape. Often they're at an interface of different kinds of resources, like an upland resource to a lowland resource, and they're a kind of place where, again, the right to be somewhere, perhaps at a particular time of the year, either with herds of animals or maybe for hunting, are being kind of noted and given permission through in a kind of sacred or a symbolic or a ritualized way. And then finally for this period, I just wanted to talk about a couple of different areas. So here's what's called a ring cairn. You often find these marked as a circle cairn. They're quite common in northwest Wales. They're very common in the Lake District also. Here, this is a monument which sometimes has pots or pits full of charcoal, things that seem to reference dead and death and the dead, but also creates a kind of space for ritual activity. And they're often in significant places in the landscape, which are significant for moving between one place to the other, like, for example, in a pass between two valleys. Here's a high mountain pass in the Langdale area. But We also, and going back to my earlier point about simple piles of stone not looking like very much, we have early features during this period which are to do with land clearance and the creation of areas of fields and also of houses. This example is from Devotwater above Eskdale, and you can see how we've got a different kind of cairn here. And again, this is why the Ordnance Survey maps can often be a bit confusing, because these are quite different in terms of their size and scale to that example that I showed you from Throskall, or to the high mountain cairns at the very top of the Carneli, which are kind of huge features. These, in many cases, can be very small, but you can see from the maps there are lots of them. And we get a clue as to their function here, which is the text field system. And I'm going to skip to another area because we've got some photographs that show very well what these are set into. So here, similar kind of thing, hut circles, field system, lots of cairns, little cairns. And this is in Trumton Burn in Perthshire in Scotland, where you can see that these very slight features here, the hut circles, so dwellings from this period about 4,000, 3,500 years ago, and then low boundary walls associated with them, and then little kind of dotted around this area, lots of little cairns, very much like this kind of thing. Now, what we've got here is a more permanently settled landscape. They're most likely year-round occupied, and they're places where people could look after and kind of keep their stock safe, but also where they could grow crops in different areas in these different paddocks. These are some of the earliest fields in Britain, and fields and field systems are something which we see a massive, and hut circles, a massive proliferation of. They become much, much more common as we go through time into the kind of later Bronze Age and into the Iron Age and so on. In most cases, they become more substantial, the features become more substantial, and we find, particularly on the kind of upland flanks, huge areas of a kind of interconnected landscape, which sits between the lowland resources and the kind of the higher pastures and the high mountains of the uplands, but over very, very large areas. But even in some areas of Britain, here in Dartmoor, you get these very large and kind of cohesive field systems very early on. Here again in Dartmoor, we're seeing a ceremonial or kind of ritual monument, a small stone circle with a cairn, and then a stone row associated with it, and then next to that, and this is OS map of the same area with the stone rows marked. Next to that, you can see a transcription of all of these field systems. You can see in the aerial photograph here, covering really a very vast area. Now, it'd be tempting to look at this kind of thing as being much earlier than this, but actually the dates show us that these are developing around the same time, just that there are different traditions in different areas. And we're at about 5 to 7. This is where I promised myself that I would get you to, which is kind of into the early Bronze Age and from the world of very kind of ritualistic, ancestral and spirit-based landscapes and their features, and into the world of cairns, field systems, cultivation and kind of landscape change, really on a kind of increasingly large scale. This is where we can go in a kind of subsequent talk if Jim's interested in covering some of the later material. It's too much for an hour, but this is the kind of the picture that I want to build up for you. I hope to build up for you. It's effectively a kind of crib sheet from OS map examples to the kind of the headlines of landscape change and the way that you can read them in the landscape. But I hope that what I've done this evening is start you off way back in the end of the last ice age, dovetailed with Jim's talk, and let me just put my video back on so I will dovetailed with Jim's talk and taken you through to about 3,500 years ago, and introduced a whole series of features that you can read from your Ordnance Survey maps introduced some examples which kind of stimulate a bit of kind of broader thought or thinking and interpretation about what these represent, so that you don't just think about them as simple piles of stone in the landscape, and kind of whet your appetite for finding out more about them. Okay, Jim, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah, John, that was it is incredible when we start to unravel all these different periods, how much information there is, and to do it justice, as you said, it's best not to race through and do that. But actually, that was fantastic, looking at the early kind of periods of our ancestry, really, where we've come from, and the depth of life and the importance, really, that the uplands have had for societies right the way through from, and you saw the images, Madagascar, and the examples overseas where, as you said, you needed creative thinking to really think, well, what was life like then, and what were these features really, what was their functions? But I'm going to open up for if there's any chat. I'll just have a quick look. I think people have just started to message now. They've been fascinating, really clear, excellent, fantastic. If there's anyone with any questions, I mean, how would people feel about a second edition? So if I do a spring series of talks, then I would love John to return and give a talk again. We have to have a pint and have a chat about that, John. Or you're on mute, John.
So Iron Age, yeah, thanks for that. Thanks, everybody. Really happy to do that. It would go from the late Bronze Age, and hoards and hoarding, you can't see them in the landscape, but it's really important to know about it, and it would take you through the kind of vast settlement landscapes we see in the Iron Age, hill forts, and then into the kind of Roman and early medieval period and so on. So there's a whole lot of goodies there.
Superb. I mean, if any questions come in a little bit, then we can. I'll have a chat with John afterwards, and we can answer those if anything comes in. Fascinating. So I've just shared my screen, if you can see that. As you know, I do like to have a little bit of interaction and feedback. So if you have a phone or a mobile handy, you can flash the QR code, or if you type in on a Google or on a web browser, menti.com, and enter the code which is on the screen, then we'll just have a quick reflection. So it's www.menti.com, and the code is 9470388. It will be at the top of the screen that's being shared as it pops up. And just your thoughts. I used to think, and your comments there. So the code at the top there, 9470388. So any of your thoughts, you used to think, and then what you now think. A lot of you have actually written things in the chat there. So I used to think that history was in the past. I used to think it was a pile of stones. That's very true. I used to think cairns were annoying, but now I'm intrigued to find out what they mean. And any thoughts on, but now you think we'll... whole amazing world to explore. But now I think that history is also in the now. Yeah, we're making it. So you used to think there wasn't much to see, that there was little to see. The past was in black and white. Very true. A walk. You used to think that walk was just a walk. So, but now I think the landscape opens up to us. So yeah, no, it's very eye-opening. I'm so pleased that John agreed to give this presentation tonight. It's been, I've never been out on the mountain with John, but I'd love to do a walk with him next year. So if our series of walks can continue next year, then I'd love to have a day with John up in the Carneddau or somewhere in North Wales. So I will let you all know if as and when that will happen. So
yeah, let's hope we can all get out again together into the landscape soon.
absolutely. But yeah, well, I'll answer any questions. And John just said he'll include any source information. Find out. I know you gave a couple of links in a couple of weeks ago, so I can
Yeah.
share those links again for everyone. But for now, really, I'd just like to wish you all kind of festive and solstice greetings. Solstice is coming up on Monday. In this kind of dark period of our year, it's quite reflective, really. I think there's a lot of rituals in the mountains over the centuries. Yes. So thank you all very much for attending tonight and in previous of my webinars, and I do hope to see you all again. So diolch yn fawr, John, and have a lovely evening, everybody. Thank you again. Bye-bye.